Our story starts today in the South Pacific, and it's the middle of World War II, and he has crashed there in the middle of the ocean. Most of his comrades, most of his colleagues have been killed in the crash, but he survived with a couple of his friends, and they're in lifeboats, and he's just kind of wondering how his life came to this moment. He had grown up in Southern California. In fact, he'd run track at Torrance. And he'd grown up in an Italian family back in a time when it wasn't popular to be Italian. Right? So I know that's changed now because we all love Italian food, but that was at the time. And so he'd grown up kind of as a hoodlum, really, learning to fight from an early age. It was his brother that spoke into his life. You know, the police were always bringing him back to the house. He had a solid family, so the police would kind of give him a break. But his brother could see the handwriting on the wall. This wasn't going to end well, and so he challenged his younger brother to get into track as kind of a hope that maybe this would help keep him on the straight and narrow, get him out of trouble. And so he began running track in high school, and he actually was very good at it. By the end of high school, he was nationally ranked and recruited by USC. Then he would end up going a few years to the Olympics, representing the United States. But all that seemed like a long time ago, as he's on this raft, they're out, for a search and rescue mission. Their engines crashed, and now they're lost at sea, and they've been there for 47 days. And they're wondering if they're ever going to see home again. Well, today, this Christmas Eve, when you think of Christmas and Christmas Eve, I'm not sure what words come to your mind. But for me, Christmas, love, joy, peace, right? Goodwill, fudge, big one. Christmas cookies, hot chocolate. I mean, these are the things, right? Maybe, if you're a church person, like Jesus, manger, wise men, shepherd, white. So, but I think if I were to ask you, take a poll of this, this group here, and say, hey, when you think of Christmas, what are the first words that come to mind? Probably courage, not in the top 10, right? So it's probably not there. And yet, as I've been reflecting the last couple of months, really preparing for this service, I've been struck by courage and how I think if we were there in the very first Christmas, if we were there in the events surrounding the birth of this child, in the coming days, weeks, months, that courage would be kind of one of the first words that would come to mind. Because when you think some of the key characters, just think it through. Mary, we talked about her this last weekend at church, right? This young, teenage girl, suddenly her life sort of derailed on a different track. She had to be open to whatever God had, both exciting but very dangerous, very risky. You think of her young fiance, this construction worker. When he first hears the news, he's not buying it. He's going to divorce her quietly, wants to avoid a scandal. And yet God challenges him, and he embraces this challenge, and he kind of faces this scandal. You think of them 9 months later, they're traveling south through kind of a dangerous journey, and they're going to make it down to his ancestral birthplace, and she's going to deliver there under, let's say, less than ideal circumstances, and she's going to have her firstborn son, and they're going to lay him in a stone manger, feeding trough for animals. It was a hard time. You think shortly after that, you think that they're woken up in the middle of the night, they've got to run for their lives, that this maniac king, who we know from secular history had already killed one of his wives, several of his sons, and other relatives to protect his throne, is after this child. And so they have to get up in the middle of the night, daring escape, run for their lives. They're going to head out to another Middle Eastern country where they're going to live for quite a while. Kind of sounds like the Middle East today. And then you think of shepherds in the field, right? And so fierce angels show up. The lights, the sky shines bright. They're scared to death. You think of the Magi, long trip. They come after they find the child. They defy this crazy king. And go home a different route, risking their lives to protect this child. So when you look at the story surrounding Christmas, it's all about courage. It's like all the key players in order to bring this child in this world, in order to protect this child to grow up with, it's all about courage. I think if you were there, it'd be kind of obvious. And the more you study the story of this child and his life and then what happens, his ministry, you see that courage is really kind of the heart of the story. that it's not like peripheral, it's like at the heart. And it's one of the things I've always loved about Jesus. I'm just drawn to him. Maybe it's as a man, he's just so courageous. He's absolutely fearless. He knows he's going against the religious and political hierarchy of the day, and yet he is going to tell the truth. He's going to speak the truth. He's going to go right at it. He's not going to back down. He's not going to back away, though he knows the consequences are coming. And so you see it throughout his life, but you especially see it on the last night of his life, the night that he's arrested. And he's going to be arrested. He knows that before him that night, he's going to be arrested. He's going to be taken into custody. He's going to be mocked. He's going to be beaten. He's going to be tortured. And then he eventually is going to be hung on a Roman cross, which is a death so gruesome that in Roman culture of the day, it was considered uncouth to talk about crucifixion in polite society. Crucifixion was something that was illegal for any Roman citizen, regardless of the crime. I mean, you could murder Caesar. They could not crucify. It was illegal. It was considered too horrendous, too humiliating, too painful. In fact, they even created a word to describe horrendous pain, and they described it as pain that comes out of the cross. We know that word today as excruciating. In Latin, it's ex out of crux, the cross. Pain that comes out of the cross. And so here's Jesus. The last night he's with his men. He knows that within 12 hours this is going to be happening. In a few hours he's going to be arrested. And yet his concern is for them and for their peace. He knows they're afraid. He's told them he's about to leave. And he's speaking in their life. He's trying to encourage them. I don't know if you've ever even thought of that word, but to encourage, to infuse someone else with courage. And there in your note sheet on the back of it, I put this because it's really remarkable when you think of the situation, the story of his life, story of his birth, and his whole life. You know, in John 14, and again, this is the last thing he's with, and this is what he says. He's speaking to his men, and he says, "Peace I leave with you." So I'm about to leave, but I'm going to leave you a gift, and the gift I'm leaving you is the gift of peace, right? Instead of fear, we're going to replace it with courage. We're going to replace it with peace. He says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace." Notice the peace I am experiencing, that I experience in the eye of the storm, that peace I give you. Notice I give you, it's a gift. He says, "I don't give you as the world gives." And so, normally we think of peace. The peace the world gives is peace during peaceful times. Like when the world is safe, we live in a safe community, we have a good job, we have our health, our family's intact, nothing's wrong, that we have peace. That's kind of peace how the world gives. He says, "No, I'm giving you peace. It's of different kind. It's being at peace, courageous in the midst of the storm." And then he goes on, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." Like, I know this is crazy what I'm telling you, but trust me, I'm bigger than this. I've got it under control. It's all going to work out. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Do not be afraid. I love how the New Living Translation puts it. There next, it says, "I'm leaving you with a gift," right? It's our topic, gift of courage. "I'm leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give is a gift the world cannot give, so don't be troubled or afraid." And so the more I've reflected on this Christmas story that leads into the life of Jesus, is that this theme of courage is right at the heart of the whole story of Jesus. That this is why he's come, that he has come to free us from our fears. That he's come to kind of restore that core relationship with God, so we know God is with us, Emmanuel, that he comes into our lives. We're not only forgiven, but we're restored. He's with us. He has a plan. He's bigger than whatever we're facing, and he will walk us through it. And so in the midst of the hard times, the crazy times, he gives us his peace. He gives us the courage to face whatever the future holds. We started today with this story of this man lost at sea. Some of you probably recognize that story because it became very famous a year ago at this time on Christmas Day. A year ago, this time on Christmas Day, the story of his life was released. His name is Louis Zamperini. How many of you have heard that name? You recognize that name? Yeah, great. Okay, so you recognize that name because this movie came out, Unbroken. It's the story of his life. And so Louis, if you don't know the story, Louis grew up here in Southern California, really a hooligan. I'd say it in Britain, I guess. But anyway, and then he's kind of a hooligan and kind of a bad guy, but he gets into running. He does really well, runs in the Olympics. And then afterwards, he is drafted by the U.S. Army in his prime. and he goes into the military and a lot of the army, but anyway, at the time, he's going to fly on planes. He becomes a master bombardier. He's going to fly on B-24s, bombers, and has some hair-raising experiences in the military, near-death experiences on these flights as he's flying in World War II in the South Pacific. But he always escapes. In fact, his nickname is Lucky Louie. Until one day they're sent out on a search and rescue mission that shouldn't be that dangerous, but two of their props go out, plane goes down, emergency landing, everyone's killed except three of them. And so there's the three of them on these two rubber rafts with a few supplies. Then they're hoping, expecting that they'll get rescued by another search and rescue because, command knows where they were searching. But one day turns to 2 days turns to 7, and it turns out to be 47 days. And while they're out there, they are just fighting for their lives. Every day is a struggle. They don't really have any water. They don't have any food. They do have a few fish hooks, and so they begin trying to catch some fish. They actually lure birds, huge birds, albatross or whatever, to land on their raft, and they attack them. And you can't really eat the meat. You can tear it open and eat the innards of it, and it kind of keeps you alive. And they got sharks surrounding them all the time, bumping them, testing the rubber to see. They're fighting off sharks. There's huge storms, one at night with like 25 to 30-foot waves. They get strafed by a Japanese fighter, takes out one of their rafts beyond repair, so now they're on 3. One of the guys dies en route. And so this is just a fight it's an amazing story. They just don't even know if they're going to make it. And finally, on the 47th day, they are rescued, captured by a Japanese ship. And so they've lost so much weight, they can't even walk. They're taken to a place he calls Execution Island because all the Americans who were taken there in the past were executed. He is just emaciated, maybe lost 50, 60 pounds. They throw him into a cell that's 6 foot long, 6 foot high, and 2.5 feet wide. And he's going to lie there in the scorching heat of the South Pacific. His room is completely filled with mosquitoes. There are no windows in this room. There's an 8-inch slit through which they throw in the most horrid food. There's a 6-inch hole in the middle of the floor for you to go to the bathroom. Your excrement goes down below, right below. It's full of maggots. He'd be pulled out routinely, blindfolded and beaten for no reason. On the sides of the wall, this wooden enclosure had been scraped in by previous prisoners, the name of 12 Marines who had gone there and never come back, been executed. He expected to die. But to his surprise, after being there, while they didn't kill him, they put him in a prisoner of war camp, but it was a secret prison of war camp, one that was not even known to the Red Cross, so particularly brutal. Because it was secret, he was never reported as a prisoner of war. And so after a year, the U.S. government sent a notice to his family that he died in ocean. So he's left there. When he went to this new prisoner of war camp, it was particularly brutal. It was led by a man the prisoners called the Bird. And he was like a sociopath. He just loved inflicting torture. And so the guards followed suit. They would beat them for no reason with sticks. They were fed very little, had very little clothing in the freezing winter, often lying almost like in a carport type of situation. They were told that if any of them tried to escape, they would shoot 10 of their buddies, so no one tried to escape. They would make them go out to work, walk a couple of miles in the snow to where they do slave labor. And the prisoners would voluntarily walk barefoot, because if they arrived at the place where they worked and they had mud on their shoes, they'd make them lick it off until it was perfectly clean. I mean, it's just horrendous. And of course, as he's going through this, all the beatings, they would line up the prisoners if they were mad at you, like they were at him one day, and they would have them line them up. If you saw the film, they portrayed this, where one after another you'd go through, and if you didn't slug him as hard as you could, they would start beating your friend. It's a long line. It was horrendous. The guards would throw hot tea in their face just to mock them. It was amazing, the suffering went through. And as you can imagine, during that 47 days at sea, during the over 2 years of suffering in the prison camps afterwards, that many times, although he was not a believer, he'd been raised, Catholic, he's Italian, right? So he was raised like Catholic, but he had like no belief. He didn't believe in God at all, but because, his situation was so desperate, like desperate times call for desperate measures, right? You see the movie, Rogue Nation? So he's calling out to God. He didn't believe in God, but he's calling out to God. He's promising God time and time again in the ocean and in the prison. If you ever get me out of here, if you save me from this, you save my life, I'll serve you forever. Well, eventually, by the way, if you happen to see the movie, probably like me, you found it hard to watch at points. But can I tell you this? When you read his autobiography that I put there on your note sheet called Devil on My Heels, it was way worse than the movie's portrayed. I think if they really showed it, I don't know if you could watch it at all. But anyway, after over 2 years in captivity, the war was over. And so like so many other prisoners of war, he was released and eventually makes his way back home. And he comes home to a hero's welcome. He has an amazing story, right? He was like an Olympic athlete, a hero of the nation who had died in the war, presumed dead, now back from life, 47 days at sea, 2 years of being beaten and yet never broken. I mean, it was an amazing story. It was featured in the New York Times right after the war. So when he came back to the LA area, he was like a star. In his autobiography, he describes it was like being Tom Cruise walking down Hollywood. And that's where he was all the time. He was hanging out at some of those famous nightclubs in the world, hanging out with all the stars, the celebrities of Hollywood. Everyone wanted to be his friend. Everywhere he went, they offered him a drink. And on the outside, his life looked like he had everything he wanted. In fact, during this period of time, he took a vacation to Florida, met a beautiful woman there from a high society background. He was from a poor background, married her, eloped, came back to California. They have a little girl. And from the outside, it looked like the future was bright. Everything was going for him. But little did the people around him know that inside, his inner world was starting to crumble. Because when he came back from Japan, he brought with him a tremendous hatred for his Japanese captors. He dreamed of a day he could go back and do to them what they had done to him. He hated them violently, understandably. And the worst of it was, though, that he couldn't escape them because every night in his dreams, he'd have these terrible nightmares where they were coming after him. And he says in his book, they were more fearful, the nightmares were more fearful than anything he'd experienced in reality. He would wake up just terrified. And so he turned to alcohol increasingly to try to sleep at night, just to get through the night. And as time went on, he became more and more addicted to alcohol. He began to experience alcoholic blackouts. He'd always been a fighter, but now he's fighting even more, fist fights in clubs, in bars. In the meantime, he had come back from the war. He had a pretty big bank account because he had over 2 years of back pay that they'd now paid him. And so he planned to invest and become rich and to do some quick rich schemes that were kind of some post-war schemes. He invested in 2 or 3. They all went south. One of his partners ripped him off. And so all of a sudden, on the outside, it was all looked great, but on the inside, his life was falling apart. He was married, had a daughter to support. He had no real skills to support himself. He'd been beaten so badly in the war, he was unable to run competitively anymore. He was increasingly addicted to alcohol. In fact, in one of his alcohol, under the influence, he had tried to choke out his wife, and she had become so disgusted with him, not working, the violence, the anger, the not supporting the family. She had already told him she was leaving. And so his life was closing around him, and these nightmares were getting worse, and he had no solution. So at that time, there was a young man who moved into the apartment complex, and they became friends. The 3 of them became friends, and one day he invited him to go to a tent meeting. There was like a evangelistic crusade in Los Angeles, and there was this new young evangelist, and no one really had heard of him, but this young kid loved him. He said, you should come and hear him. And, of course, Louis wanted nothing to do with this. He's not a believer. In fact, all the promises he'd made to God during the war, he'd quickly forgotten all those, reneged on all those. His wife, every once in a while, was interested in the church. He tried to discourage her. He was really anti-God, had no need for God in his life. And so he had no interest in going. But his wife wanted to go. And so she went, and God met her in a powerful way. And she kept nagging at him to the point, and he was so down, he finally agreed at least to go, expecting the worst. When he got there, very different than what he expected. He expected a lot of high emotionalism, craziness, holy rollers or something. It wasn't like that at all. The young evangelist was a young man named Billy Graham, just starting his ministry. He was sharp, he was articulate, he was winsome, he was well-spoken, he was well-informed. He talked a lot about science, which was one of Louis' loves. But the more he talked, the more Louis felt threatened. He began to feel a fear. There was something about this God, something about this message that he found terrifying. Billy talked about giving your life to Christ. He talked about surrendering your life to God for the purposes he had. And Louis had never surrendered to anyone, even in the harshest conditions during the war. He had never been broken. And so he resisted, but the longer he sat there, the more unnerving it got. He kept thinking of all the reasons, all the objections to Jesus and all the objections to the message of Christ. And one by one, every time he had an objection, it was like Billy was reading his mind. He'd speak to that. And he was getting kind of freaked out. And so as time went on, he just felt this fear rising up with him. And he had to get away. And he grabbed his wife's hand. He stood up towards the end of the message, and they stomped out. He said, don't ever take me back to one of those meetings. But that night, the nightmares came back, and they were the worst they'd ever been. And he woke up choking the pillow next to him, and he realized if it was his wife, she'd be dead. And so, combined with her constant pleading all day that he would go back, he agreed to go on one condition, that when it came time for the invitation at the end to go forward and give your life to Christ, that they leave at that moment. And she agreed. And so he went. And once again, same phenomenon. It felt like Billy was speaking just to him. It felt like this powerful message. It felt like God was after him. He said it got so heavy towards the end, he felt like he couldn't breathe, like his throat was literally constricted. He felt like there was a huge weight on his chest. And he felt like he just had to get out of there and get a drink. And so when it came time for the invitation, he grabbed his wife's hand. They moved quickly down the aisle. And as he gets to the aisle, well, let me read you what happens. I want you to sit back for a couple minutes because I want you to hear this in his own words. He says, let's go, Cynthia. I grabbed her hand. I pulled her up. I've had enough. I walked down the row, squeezing between people's knees and chairs, dragging my downcast wife behind me. Finally, I got to the aisle. I stepped onto the sawdust path and knew it was a crossroads of decision. I fought against it perhaps harder than I'd ever fought. There was a battle inside me for my soul. But in the end, I made my decision. I turned right toward Billy Graham. I released my wife's hand, and she said, go. I walked forward and realized that my decision was like running a race. You know, he's talked about before he ran a race, he was so nervous to run, but once he heard the gun sound, he started. The adrenaline came, and he was ready. It just felt exactly like that. He said this was a different race, but a race nonetheless, a race for life, my life. When he went forward, he met the counselor. They went back to pray. He says, I dropped to my knees, and for the first time in my life, I truly humbled myself before the Lord. I asked him to forgive me for not having kept the promises I'd made during the war and for my sinful life. I made no excuses. I didn't rationalize. I didn't blame. Billy had said, and he quoted from Paul's letter to the Romans, whoever shall call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And so I took him at his word. I begged for his pardon. I asked Jesus to come into my life. I waited, and then true to his promise, he came into my heart, my life. The moment was more than remarkable. It was the most realistic experience I'd ever had. I felt no tremendous sensation, just a weightlessness and an enveloping calm that let me know that Christ had come into my heart. My lifelong desire for revenge had disappeared, including my need to get even with the Japanese and the bird. The next morning I woke up and I realized I hadn't had a nightmare about the bird. And to this day, I have never had another. It was as if a doctor had cut out that hating part of my brain. After breakfast, he told Cynthia I needed to be alone. He walked a half mile to Barnesdale Park and began to read his Bible. He says, for the first time in my life, the beautiful story made clear sense. I began to cry, overwhelmed by emotion. For many years, the Bible had been a mystery to me, but now it was an open book. This was the clincher. How could I suddenly understand the Bible when I never could before? How often I'd picked it up and put it down because I couldn't make heads or tails of what it was all about. But with the Holy Spirit as my interpreter, the meaning were obvious. I sat on the bench all morning and I thanked God for my life from the day I was born, for all that I'd been and been through, all that I lost, all the times I tried to change and failed, all the times I'd prayed to survive and had. Otherwise, I'd never had known Christ. The Lord had seen to it that I'd made it through every life-threatening situation and that I lost in every business venture because that's what brought me to the Lord. And now I knew that God's hand had always been upon me and prepared me for this moment. Louis went on to be a changed man. That night he met this Prince of Peace. And the greatest fear that he faced was this fear that he couldn't change himself and get his life back. He said it was a fear bigger than anything experienced in captivity or in the ocean. It was terrifying. That moment, that Prince of Peace came, broke through his night, kind of like the angels on that first Christmas with the word, do not fear. And his life changed. And he's the first to say it wasn't easy after that. He said, becoming a Christian doesn't solve all your problems overnight. And it was hard. It was a lot he had to work through. But the difference was God was there empowering him every step of the way. He reconciled with his wife. And soon he began traveling with Billy Graham, sharing the story of his transformed life, how this God had taken away his hatred and fear and filled them with peace and love. Eventually, he would travel to Japan, and he would go back to every prison that he had been in, sharing the message of Christ. He met with all of his captors except the bird. The bird wouldn't meet with him. But he met with all the guards. He wanted to meet personally and told them he had forgiven them and that there was a God who could forgive them too. And many gave their life to Christ. When he came back afterwards and he started working with young boys who had gone through hard times and were delinquent, just like he was growing up. He lived an amazing life. He became a member at Hollywood Press. He began working with youth there. We had some friends in our church that were in his Sunday school class. You see, that night, he faced his biggest fear. Because in the end, his biggest fear wasn't the sea. His biggest fear wasn't even the Japanese camps or even the nightmares. In the end, his biggest fear was surrendering to this God who is pursuing him. But it's in surrendering that he found peace. And that day, he met the Prince of Peace who gave him the gift of courage. light broke into his darkness, and his life would never be the same.